Hey everybody, welcome back to the third video in the series related to April 21st's class. Alright, where we left off, we were talking about the SARA model of problem-oriented policing, and as I mentioned, next step here is to walk through each of these steps and just give you a little bit of background about what is meant to occur at each of the steps. Right, so this first step of the SARA model is scanning to identify patterns. Right, so what we do during the scanning phase of problem-oriented policing is, first of all, to reduce our big problems into more manageable problems. So what do I mean by that? Right, if we think about violent crime as a whole, it's probably pretty unlikely that if we are just entering this process of the SARA model as saying we want to reduce violent crime, it's probably unlikely we're going to be able to have an impact on every single violent crime, right? Because violent crime is a pretty broad category, right? That involves things like robberies, assaults, and arsons, and the approach toward having an impact on those problems or these crimes is going to likely be different depending upon the crime that we're talking about. So when we reduce big problems into more manageable ones, one of the things that is more likely to happen is, since we've got a narrower focus, we're going to increase our likelihood of actually successfully addressing this problem. When we're focused on a very specific problem that's manageable, we've got fewer moving parts that we need to keep track of, and it also ensures that we're going to have enough resources available to actually have an impact on a problem. Right, so that's why we want to take big problems and kind of break them down into more manageable pieces and try to focus on only those pieces that are most harmful. So just to make this a little bit clearer, right, if we think about Part 1 crime, or also referred to as violent crime, right, there's all sorts of different problems that we might have for violent crime. So we could have violence in and around problem bars. We could have robberies around SEPTA stations, which are subway stations here in Philadelphia. We could have robberies around an individual SEPTA station. And so only until we scan for our problem and break down the problem and really understand it, are we going to be able to identify what our true issue is. And if we do that and we can successfully break our broad category like violent crime down to a much more specific one, such as one of the sub-bullets I have up here on the screen, more of a likelihood we're going to be successful, and probably more of a likelihood that we're going to have resources to deal with these individual problems as well. You could say the same thing about property crime. There's all sorts of different types of property crimes, and when we get to the response phase of the SARA model, the response is probably going to differ depending on what our problem is. So for property crime, one issue we might have, one problem would be theft from motor vehicles in parking garages or parking lots, or we might have a problem of daytime residential burglaries at hotspots. And again, this should hopefully make clear that what we do at a parking garage is probably going to look a little bit different than what we'll choose to do at a residential burglary hotspot in terms of addressing the problem. So that's why we want to break these big problems. We don't want to think about problems as being these broad categories. We really want to break them down and be very specific about what our problem is. Right, so our second step is then going to be to analyze this problem. And here what we're going to try to do is to determine the causes of our problem through data collection and analysis. Right, and so we know based on some of the things we talked about earlier in the semester that, and again we've talked about a couple of different definitions for analysis, but generally speaking it's the systematic collection of knowledge about a particular problem and the drawing of inferences from that information. And so when we did hypothesis testing last week, we were doing just this, right? This type of analysis. So one way where we can that we can analyze crime is to follow that hypothesis testing framework that we went through last week. Right? Just because hypothesis testing is not explicitly stated in the SARA model of problem-oriented policing doesn't mean that we still can't use it. And as I mentioned last week, hypothesis testing is my preferred method of analysis. So it's something we've learned and we could now apply to this SARA model of problem-oriented policing. And as we did last week, we could then use our data that we've collected to actually test the hypotheses to see if we find support for what we believe to be the contributors to the problem that we are trying to address. And this class is all about analysis, as you've learned so far. We're getting near the end of the semester, so you know that this is a course on analysis, particularly crime analysis, but we also learned that there's all sorts of different crime analysis that crime analysts will engage in during their work. And so with problem-oriented policing, similar to what we did last week with hypothesis testing, analysis is supposed to be geared toward developing an understanding of what contributes to the problem that we're trying to have an impact on. Right, so this would be different from something like tactical analysis, which in fact we really haven't gotten into much this semester as well. Right, but tactical analysis, what we're trying to do there is to identify kind of new emerging patterns and try to thwart those patterns from becoming large-scale problems. Right? So it's definitely much more short-term focused. With problem-oriented policing, it's much more a longer-term focus. So we're trying to have an impact on problems that we've been facing as a jurisdiction for many months or years or decades. Right, but again, the goal with analysis during the SARA model is to develop a very deep understanding of what contributes to our problem so that we can then get to the next step, which is the response phase, and actually have an impact, right? Put together strategies and implement them in the field that are going to have a positive impact. And one way to kind of structure your thinking as you're going about an analysis, or the analysis phase of the SARA model, is use what's referred to as the problem analysis triangle. And so with the problem analysis triangle, what it does is it breaks crime down to kind of the most basic level. So it's based a little bit on routine activities theory, which is a theory I'm sure you've heard if you took a theory class. But if you think about a crime, we've got three kind of big components. We've got an offender, we have a place where this crime occurs, and we have a target or victim. Right, so we need these three things to be present in order for a crime to occur. If we can address one aspect of this crime triangle or this problem analysis triangle, then hopefully we can prevent crimes from happening in the first place. And so what that means is we need to have an understanding of who is controlling or supervising these aspects of a crime. So in other words, we want to make sure that we have an understanding of who is handling offenders. And handlers could be parents or ministers or even a probation or parole officer, and someone who's watching over a potential offender. In terms of places, we have place managers. Right? So if you think of a bar or a restaurant, there's a manager who is kind of regulating behavior within their establishment. And so if we've got a bar, for example, that has poor management practices where they're constantly over-serving people, right, we want to know that and then potentially leverage this knowledge to improve management practices at a place. Again, this is kind of outside of what most people think of as policing, but we could potentially have much more of an impact by changing policies, right, in an establishment than we would have by simply randomly patrolling. And then finally, for targets or victims, we have guardians who watch over these targets or victims. And so a guardian could just simply be a person on the street whose eyes and ears, right? If we've got a neighborhood, for example, and we've got the old grandmother that sits on her stoop every day and sits and watches that street, she could act as a guardian. Right? A police officer could act as a guardian, security guard. Right, so we want to understand not only each aspect of this problem analysis triangle, but also who has a role to play on each during each aspect, or at each aspect, I should say. Excuse me there. All right, so as you go about not only completing the exercise that you're going to do later on in this class, what you'll want to do moving forward if you get into crime analysis is use this to kind of structure your thinking. And so in the analysis phase of the SARA model, what we'll want to do is to probe all of the characteristics of a problem and factors that contribute it and get really fine-grained and detailed information about our problem, which could include things like who the offenders are, who the victims are, right? Other people who might be involved. When is this problem most prevalent? Where is it prevalent? Is there anything in particular about the physical environment that might be contributing to why we see this problem at this particular place? What's the history of the problem? When did we start seeing this as a problem? What are the motivations, gains, and losses for all parties involved? Right? So we could be talking about not just offenders here, but also we could be thinking about guardians and handlers and all of the people we talked about in the previous slide. The apparent and the potentially not so apparent causes of this problem, as well as the result of all of the current responses that we've tried to put in place, right? Have they been successful or not successful? So in other words, what we're looking for here is the who, what, where, how, why, and what of crime. Right? So these are this is another way you could think about breaking down analysis, right? You want to try to establish these different aspects, right? The who, what, where, when, how, why. So, as I said, I didn't want to spend too much time on analysis because that's what this whole class is about. But the next step of the SARA model, once we've done an analysis, is to actually implement a response, right? To find strategies to intervene in that causal chain. So as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and that's really been emphasized whenever I've lectured, is that we want to implement effective responses. So in other words, we want to use evidence-based policing. We want to have an understanding of what the research evidence says about our problem. And so I pointed you last week to the Pop Center website because I mentioned that there's probably a problem-oriented policing guide on whatever problem a jurisdiction is facing. So I've just got one example here, homeless encampments. And involved in or included in these problem-oriented policing guides is information and experience that other police agencies have had in trying to address this problem. Right? So in the homeless encampments problem-oriented policing guide, you're going to have actual results from different jurisdictions around the country and beyond that have where we've got successful ways of dealing with homeless encampments. So you'll be using a problem-oriented policing guide today when you look at the prostitution module that you're going to look at the end of this lecture. And again, I don't want to spend too much time about the response phase because this is going to vary depending on the problem that we're trying to address. And the final step is we want to assess, right? We want to evaluate whether what we did worked to achieve our goal. And so if we're talking about crime reduction, did we see a reduction in crime? And there's all sorts of ways that we can assess whether what we've done worked. So how we do this and how knowledge has been generated is through designs like experiments or quasi-experiments. And I talk quite a bit about research design in my critical issues class. And if you've taken that class, you know I really harp on research design because it does make a difference in terms of what evidence we should use or whether we should use particular evidence. Right? We want to take a look at the design and make sure that it was of high quality. That's not always possible to do experiments or even quasi-experiments in police agencies. So what we'll do next week is we'll use a tool called the weighted displacement quotient to develop a pretty good way that departments can assess whether what they're doing has been working. But this is a big part and often overlooked part in policing, is this last step, seeing whether what we've done works. So I'm getting towards the end of my lecture here. I just want to close by talking a little bit about how problem-oriented policing is unique. And I really want to drive home the point that law enforcement, like arrests and summonses, these are just tools. Right? POP tries to get police to think outside of the box and use solutions to address the problems. And I always teach it, when I teach actual law enforcement officers, as trying to achieve these goals of problem reduction without using law enforcement. Right? Police tend to be really good at law enforcement. They are very good at making arrests and writing tickets and all of that. However, what we want to do is try to think outside the box. So I do always start my courses with police officers saying, we're going to pretend that you can't make an arrest. That doesn't mean that you can't make arrests with problem-oriented policing, but I like to kind of frame the discussion that way. Right? Because we know that, and really it's pretty rare, the circumstances are rare where we're going to solve a problem simply through arrests. Right, so that's how POP is different. So what I'll do is I will close here and I'll make one more video where I'm going to introduce you to the module you're going to complete. So I will see you there.